Okay, good morning to everyone and welcome to day two, session two. In this particular session, we're going to cover creating interaction in online sessions. And we're going to look at this from a couple of different perspectives. We're going to look at this from both the synchronous and the asynchronous modalities. As we're talking about, and what I know you're doing is you're going to be looking to kind of blend all of these in together, with the idea through the pandemic that you're going to try as much face-to-face as you can, as much as it works but with the idea that you can also blend some of the asynchronous as well as some of the synchronous materials that you're looking to do. So we're going to kind of cover and go through a number of those things. All right. What I want to do, just with some objectives here, is I want to talk about the different types of online interactions. We will kind of relate back to the different course types that we talked about yesterday. We're going to talk a little bit about facilitating the different instructional pedagogies that can generate interaction and what kind of things that you can do in the classroom. We're going to talk about online pedagogies that create engaged and active online learning. There's what kind of things can you do that generate engagement? How do we engage our students? And that becomes the big thing. It's easy to do that in a face-to-face because you read them, you see them. But when you put them into a synchronous session like this, as you can see from yesterday, it's a different dynamic altogether, the levels of interaction that you generate, and it takes a different type of facilitation to get people to be active rather than passive. Because if you think about it, in the synchronous session like this, it's a talking head. You're watching television, you're seeing somebody, so we innately become passive. And the key thing that we want to do is generate interaction. We want to get them interacting with what we talked about yesterday, interacting with you, interacting with the content, and interacting with other students through this technology. We're going to talk also about something called the conversational tone. There's some literature out there that talks about how we engage with this. I kind of alluded to that yesterday in talking that online should not be, in other words, students shouldn't view this as stereo instructions. In other words, through how you speak, but also how and what you write in text. So those are some of the things we're going to look at. We're also going to look at something called instructor presence. A lot of times, and those of you who have taken an online course and kind of yesterday said, well, it wasn't the greatest thing, it was most likely because you didn't have enough interaction with the instructor and the instructor wasn't seen in the course. Whether it's through synchronous, whether it's through asynchronous, the instructor has to be present. Now, there's a point where you're over the top, but there's a point where you're under. So you got to find that balance, and we'll talk a little bit about what that all means. We're going to talk about synchronous sessions and some of the best practices and some of the things to do as you're running and setting up a synchronous session. And we're going to talk about some navigation issues, which are also part of this interaction. And it's how we get students to interact with the technology per se. So these are the things we're going to do. And as I said yesterday, I want to make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to jump in, unmute yourselves and ask any questions that you have. We'll be glad to answer it. What I would like to do is as we get through all this, and I've got a fair amount of material here today, but as we get through this, I really would like to open this up for any kind of a panel open discussion questions that you have. Specific to your own areas, specific to your own teaching, your own disciplines, and your own students. So we can kind of address some of those as you need to as well. All right, so let's start with instructor presence. What is instructor presence? You'll also hear the term in the literature called teacher presence or teaching presence, and they are different in the literature, but it's related to the idea of interaction. When you start talking about instructor presence, it's related to the concept of how we interact in a class. It works to illustrate that students who feel they are part of a group or present in a community will participate more. We also know from the literature that students, and I mentioned this yesterday, students who have greater interaction with their instructors and develop that rapport. This is one of the things that we do in a face-to-face, and we spend a fair amount of time allowing students to see who we are, and we develop that rapport with them, not a friendship, but we develop a rapport where a student can learn from us. This is even more important in any kind of an online atmosphere, whether it's synchronous, whether it's asynchronous. It's probably exacerbated more in the lower grades than it is in the higher grades. Higher grades have a tendency to be a little bit more self-directed, not a lot, but a little bit more self-directed. But lower grades rely more heavily on their interactions with teachers. So this instructor presence is of great importance, and something that as you develop any online materials, asynchronous or synchronous, that you need to keep that in mind. How am I going to interact with my students, and how are they going to see me? Because think about this, your students rely quite heavily on you as teachers. Moving to the online does not remove that need. And just posting things up does not remove that need. And sometimes what we see, and I would probably, if we spent some time pulling out why you liked certain courses online or why you didn't like them, it was most likely because you didn't have a great interaction with your instructor, didn't have that rapport. So it has to be I always say this, it has to be an intentional thing. That you as the teacher, as you are teaching in an online environment, you have to be very, very intentional to make sure that you are getting that interaction, that you are there and that the students can see you. Okay? So we'll talk more about that as we kind of go through. Okay, so instructors need to be seen. But the question is there a point where it's too much? Is there a point where it's too little? I mean, there's sometimes that we don't want to dominate, especially if you've got students doing things, if they're in some kind of a discussion or they're in some kind of group work. You know, the same way that you sit back in your face-to-face classes and you watch how much are you taking control and when do you allow the students to take that control as far as the teaching goes or as far as the learning goes. You know, when you put them into groups, when you have them do cooperative learning type activities, you relinquish a fair amount of that control and put it into their hands to allow them to be more active and engaged. You want to do that exact same thing when you move to some kind of an online format. But you need to find that balance again. Okay, you want to be careful that you don't remove the self-directed nature of some of the online learning. And again, this is based upon the students, the level, the content, where they're at, and what you know their needs are. So think of it this way. You're trying to mirror what you do successfully in the face-to-face. You're trying to transition that type of engaged, active learning in the online as well. It just takes a little different thinking with that. So I think instructors need to make very, very great efforts to plan to be timely in responses to students, to be present, to answer questions. And this becomes a key thing. If you're doing an asynchronous kind of a lesson and students are out there kind of sometimes feeling that they're learning on their own, the general rule is to respond, or general rule was to respond within 24 hours to students through some kind of an email or discussion board or some kind of an asynchronous communication. But I think that expectations of that these days are far greater than that. I can tell you in the higher ed classes, you know, I've been teaching online for several years. Years ago, it used to be, we'd say, yeah, I'll get back to you within 24 hours. Just email me a question or send me something, I'll get back to you. But I think the expectations, you know, these days, you know, how many of you are carrying around? I mean, I'm walking around Giant Eagle on a Saturday afternoon with my wife. We're doing whatever shopping, and I'm sitting there checking emails or going through a quick discussion board thing. And she says, are you really that bored already? And while I may be, it's just I know I'm teaching an online class and I know students are in there. So I just want to be timely in my responses. So a lot of times I'm answering as quickly as I can because they're looking for a faster response in 24 hours. I mean, they want to hear from you within the hour in some cases. In some cases, less. They want instantaneous. So they're used to that, and the students that you have are used to that within a very short period of time within the face-to-face. So they're going to expect that same kind of level of learning and level of response from you, level of presence, if you want to call it, in any kind of an online format. So Bobine, and this goes back to 2002, but it is still relevant today. He describes the personal factors that contribute to quality facilitation and instructor presence. And he lists them out as these 5: persona, presence, perturb the system, playfulness, and positive feedback. The persona is you as the instructor letting your identity and your values to be seen. Now, your students get to know you and they develop that rapport with you and they get to see who you are when you stand in front of them and they have a face-to-face. Your personality comes across. The interactions, the rapports, I don't want to say friendships, but they develop a relationship with you. It's a professional relationship, but it is a relationship nonetheless. So you're able to let them see that in the face-to-face. We also need to let them see that in both the synchronous and the asynchronous type of modes and when we teach. Okay, and that's something that has to be, all of these have to be something that we do overtly. We have to make sure that we are making our students see who we are. The idea of what he calls presence, we need to be seen in the course. The students need to know we're there. In fact, one of the things that I do at Robert Morris is I review a number of courses. As faculty are building courses, I have the opportunity to kind of look at them, and I can tell very quickly by looking at a course whether an instructor is there or they're not. A lot of times if they're posting something up, then it's, how do I say this? It's like it's a very cold course. There's no warmth to it. There's no interaction. There's no teacher presence. There's just nothing to build on. It is stereo instructions. And I think some instructors think building this up, I need to type things out. I need to write things out in a very formalized fashion. And that's not what Bobine is saying. That's not what instructor presence is. You need to be seen in the course. And as you're seen, you need to have that persona also be seen. He also talks about perturbing the system. In other words, as you start to see, this is something that we do in our face-to-face classes. We ask questions, we challenge students, we make sure that students are moving along and that they're learning. And if students are not, then we perturb by asking some kind of question, or we pose an assignment, or we do the things that are going to facilitate students to learn. Sometimes when people move to an online, they think, well, everything is pretty static. All I need to do is just post up some lessons, post up some material, and move on. That's not what this is. We need to be teaching. Just because we've moved to an online format, just because we've moved to synchronous or asynchronous, doesn't mean the teaching is lost. We need to continue to teach what we're doing, and we need to perturb that system. We need to ask questions. We need to facilitate. We need to read the group and adjust our lessons as we do in any face-to-face. The other thing that he says is we need to be playful. Think about it. When you're standing in front of a classroom, you're having fun. You're having a good time with your students. I mean, years ago, somebody asked me what I do for work, and I said, well, I don't really see what I do for work as work. I'm a teacher. I enjoy teaching, and I just don't find it to be work. And when I'm in front of a classroom, it's a good time. I'm just having fun teaching. The students, I'm hoping, are having fun. And fun is not the enemy of learning. In fact, we know from some of the research that the brain is never learning more than when it's having fun. So there's no reason not to have fun. There's no reason not to be playful in what you do. You do that in your face-to-face classes. You have fun, you make jokes, you do those kind of things. There's no reason not to do that in your online classes. The other thing is you need to provide positive feedback. And I think this needs to be exacerbated in the online, because everything we do needs to be accentuated a little bit, because sometimes things don't translate through text, which is what you're writing through the asynchronous, or through synchronous kind of modes. You need to accentuate those things as we kind of move forward. So provide feedback. Let students know, because they're operating in a sense of isolation. They're operating in an area where they're not sure. They're kind of hanging out there on their own in cyberspace. And they're not sure, am I getting this? Am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? You give them feedback in class. I mean, you walk by a student's desk and say, yeah, that's good. You're doing what you're right on target. Or they'll raise their hand, you walk over and go, yeah, you're good. Those kind of things need to be done also in any kind of an online. When your students are learning at home, when they're locked down in this pandemic, we need to make sure that we are sending those positive feedbacks. One of the things that I do, and I don't know that I have it in here, but I try and give feedback. I'll do call outs from week to week on students. In other words, when we do discussion boards, or I've had assignments or things that everybody's interacting with, I will call out a student and say, hey, if you haven't had a chance, please read Leslie's post on such and such. It talks about this and this. It's very worthwhile time. Calling them out sometimes like that in a positive way gives them that kind of positive feedback. It does the same kind of thing, even more so than what you do in a face-to-face. So those are kind of the things that Bovine talks about. He further talks that instructor does not need to be intrusive, however. There's a point where you are over present. In other words, where it's just you. You don't do that in your face-to-face classes. You have students working, you have them doing assignments, you have them doing different things, and you're not always standing in front of the room talking, or you're not always the center of attention in your class. Your content is. So you need to find, again, that balance of what goes on. And it's not one size fits all again. Presence in a high school class versus a middle school versus, elementary, early childhood, these are different. And you have to know your students and you have to read them. Again, presence needs to be known. They need to see that you're there, but you need to find that proper balance. Sometimes within discussions or within emails, short posts are good. No different than what you do in a face-to-face. You walk by a student's desk, go, that's good work. Or no, try this, correct this. No, that's not quite accurate if you adjust this. Those are the things that we do in class, and you want to do those same things. It's just a different way to communicate. You need to find what we talk about is something called the teachable moment. We do this every day, no matter what. In fact, you probably do this 1,000 times a day and don't realize it. You have those teachable moments where a student is either getting something and you want to support what they've done, or they're just off a little bit and not quite getting it and you want to correct it. Those are all teachable moments, and you want to capitalize on those as much as you can. So that requires that we're there. That requires that we're interacting through email. We're interacting through, the Google Classroom questions or whatever assignments that we're providing feedback on. But you need to find a way that you are interacting. I think more and more as more of our parents are involved in the teaching process, given this lockdown, we want to make sure that we're interacting with them as well. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday toward the end. You want to make sure that you're reaching out. If your parents are taking a certain level of responsibility, and I would tend to think that's at the lower grades, then you want to kind of interact with them as well, because they're kind of serving as teachers' aides in many respects. So something to think about as well. You can stimulate things through questions, getting students to think about it, whether it's through some kind of a formalized assignment, whether it's through just an email assignment, whether it's synchronous where you drop a question out there. But that dynamic takes a different toll or a different way. Think about this. How many questions over the last day and a half or day plus have I thrown out? And everybody doesn't jump up to respond. Now, that's not a knock at anybody. That's just the way that this dynamic works with a synchronous session. So you have to be open to waiting more time and facilitating and potentially calling on different groups to kind of answer some things and pull from the group. Not always an easy thing to do, but it's something that's a little different. This, I think, is key. Instructor need to model the presence. They need to set the tone for what goes on. You do this in your classroom. You have certain expectations of your students, but you model those expectations every day. If you want your students to be organized, then you're organized. You model exactly. In fact, as teachers, I don't think that there's ever a point that we can't model. And we all kind of know this. They see everything. They are looking at everything that they know what you wear, they know what you say, they know what you do, they know when you're in a good mood, they know when you're in a bad mood. They just know. And sometimes you think that they're not seeing certain things, but they do. They see everything. Well, this modeling needs to go on within the online. So if you're looking for students to be organized in the online, and you're looking for them to have certain organization and certain dates, then you need to model that as well. So that when the students are to turn things in or to keep things organized, they have you to look for as a model for that as well. Now, we talked a little bit, and I mentioned earlier, I was going to talk about something called conversational tone. A lot of times when an instructor moves to an online format, they become very formalized in their communications. more so than the communications that we do in a face-to-face. Somehow we think moving to an online where we're putting everything in text, when you type things out, you write things down, that we now need to become very, very formalized. And like I said yesterday, earlier today, it becomes reading like stereo instructions. It's cold. It's very matter of fact. That's not what students are looking for. They need to make that connection with you, that rapport. And one of the greatest ways you can do that is through utilizing a conversational tone. That conversational tone is really nothing more than how you speak to people. In other words, when you're standing in front of a classroom, you're talking to the group as if you would be talking to anybody. You use a conversational tone in your speaking. But when we move to the online where you can't see the student and you can't read, because if you're like me as a teacher, you feed off of your students. You read them and you move forward. You get the positives, you get the negatives, you kind of read where they're at, and that becomes part of the controlling factor in how you teach and how you respond and what you do and react. So that kind of gets lost a little bit when you move to the asynchronous specifically, which is predominantly text-based environment. Also, if you're doing synchronous, you don't get that same kind of feedback. So you have to utilize and you have to force in to make sure that you are keying things in the same way that you would talk. So text information and synchronous communications, these are important. Asynchronous, you can do oral communications through some kind of a narrated PowerPoint or video. And I don't know if Google Classrooms allows this, some LMSs do, where you can drop in an audio. In other words, you can put a short audio file in and it just gives a verbal communications. And you can do those kind of things and just, as you're doing your narrated PowerPoints, make sure that you're talking to the group and picturing who's standing in front of you. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. How many of you have done narrated PowerPoints before? A couple of you have. Do you find them weird? I mean, when you create them, when you're producing them, I find it because I'll go quietly off someplace. I'll, get down to my family room or I'll go into my office and close the door. And you sit there and you put a PowerPoint up in front of you and you start talking through it and you're talking to no one. And it just becomes just a little weird as you're sitting there doing that because you don't get that feedback from your students and you don't read from them. And sometimes people, and I've seen folks do this, where you just become very, very matter of fact and very formal in your speech. Maintain, and the only thing I can tell you to do is just pretend you're talking to the group. Pretend of who is supposed to be sitting in front of you, or who in essence is going to hear this. And then you're more likely to use that conversational tone and speak like you normally would. I think the key element is maintain the same persona as used in any of your face-to-face classes. This becomes that transitional pedagogy that I was talking about yesterday. It's important, I think, for students not to feel that they're learning in isolation, that they're not learning alone. And sometimes what we've heard through, and not through any of your students or anybody, I think just in general, we have heard that moving all of this through this COVID to the online, they're missing interaction with their instructors. They're missing the time with their teachers. So we need to find ways to do that so that we can continue to assist them, that they're not learning alone, and that they continue to develop a rapport with their instructors throughout this process. I did some research a few years ago and I talked to several teachers about the utilization of this. And in doing this qualitatively, I found some very interesting things. One teacher stated, teaching online is still teaching. And I found that developing a relationship with my online students is just as important, if not more so, than in the traditional classroom. Another teacher said, I try to think how my students will receive the information from the other side of a computer as either text or voice communications through my narrated PowerPoint lectures, and then talk to them as if they were sitting in front of me. These were just different things, and it was like, okay, now I kind of get it. I understand. Holmberg told us that feelings of empathy and belonging promote the student's motivation to learn and influence the learning favorably. So I guess I would ask, what's the difference between empathy and sympathy? What's the difference between empathy and sympathy? Anybody have any ideas?
You're unmuted.
Anybody? Like a few trying to answer. What's the difference between empathy and sympathy?
Empathy is like trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes, to feel.
That means you've been in the other.
Yeah, empathy means you've been in their shoes. Sympathy is you're trying to.
Okay.
Sympathy means you have compassion for someone, but empathy means you've actually experienced it.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think sympathy is, I see you're going through something, and I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I feel bad you're going through something. Empathy is, you're able to put yourself in that person's shoes. You're able to understand innately. And as teachers, we are empathetic to our students' needs because we have been there in our past. We have all taken the journey that they're starting on. So that's empathy. Empathy is something that we as instructors need to be employing in our classroom. We need to be empathetic. Empathy is helped through interactions where students are addressed directly and that conversational tone is employed. This is seen pervasively throughout the literature. Holmberg is quoted quite a bit through that literature as to what empathy and how you can generate empathy. And his big thing is the conversational tone will generate that. You simply, and you say, well, I'm not seeing that. No, you're not, but your students are. If you're writing, you're texting things, you're written and audio communications are using that conversational tone, your students will pick up that sense of empathy, even if it's not personally directed at them. If you're directing it an entire class, they're still going to get that feeling of empathy. What it does is, yes, sir.
Can I ask a question? Question about this conversational tone and when having, the remote classes last spring, of course, when I teach algebra 2. So when I'm teaching, I'm asking questions.
Sure.
And some of them are responding, but others are not. Some have their screen facing up to the ceiling, or some have their, screen, off or whatever. But, how do you, I don't know if you have practical tips on how to, engage them more other than, asking questions, other suggestions.
Good question. And this is an issue. And I think part of this, put this into perspective. When your students are sitting in front of you, you have certain expectations, you have certain routines. If a student puts their head down in your class, what do you tell them to do?
Please put your head up.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's quite that simple. I mean, if somebody is not paying attention, you have a variety of different techniques that you can utilize in a face-to-face class that will draw them back in. Something as simple as moving close to them, or, asking them, throwing out a question, or calling them out if it has to be. All of those things are things that you have and set down as classroom management, classroom routine, all of those things, and you've set certain expectations. And I will tell you this, when your students, and you may not realize this, but when your students walk into your classroom, they know what your expectations are. They know what you're willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept. They figure that out within the first week of class. Okay?
Right.
This now has to be translated to the online as well, so that when you're running a classroom, you set those expectations. So if a student is doing this, where their camera is up and they're off screen, you need to establish and say, no, everybody, I need to see faces. Okay, you need to establish those expectations right up front so that they know exactly what they're doing. I want you to mute your mics, but be prepared to, mute your mics and tell them why, just because of the background noise, so that everybody can hear. But I want to see that everybody is here. I want to see your face. Tell them all the expectations and the things that you expect them to do. And when they don't do it, then you call them out on it. I mean, it's really that simple. It's just And then that allows you different. And I think you set the expectations early on with participation, because I will be honest with you, the participation is a little more strained in the synchronous. And I think you probably found that when you throw a question out, nobody answers because you're not there. And they think that they're separate.
My experience is that I had to call on individuals rather than, in a normal class, I would ask and someone would respond without me having to call on someone individually. And the other struggle is that sometimes you're going around and checking on their work. Like you can't really do that, when you're online.
Well, you can.
You can ask them to give the answer, but to see their work, well, in a math context, that was challenging.
Yeah, and I understand exactly what you're saying with the math context. This is a technological challenge. There are some ways that you can do it. You can, simply have a student raise, something to the camera and show their work, but that's kind of cumbersome. You can also, especially if you're having them do something electronically, which you're probably not, although if they're connected in, you could have them share and present their work. I mean, that's something that could be done as well. The way that I'm sharing and presenting in the screen, you can have your students do that exact same thing. But math problems, they're doing it on a piece of paper. So they're not doing it the same way. The best way I could tell you to do something like that would be just to have them post something up at the camera. I mean, if everybody had doc cams, that'd be a little easier, but they don't. So you kind of have to work within the framework of what you've got. You could have a student simply share up on the screen. It might be some way to do that. But again, I agree with you. You initially have to set those expectations. So you're calling on students and saying, okay, Bobby, what's your response? How would you get this? What did you do? And I think you initially have to do that until such a point that they start to get it, that they're now interacting more and more and more. And I think this is a learning curve for them as the same as it's a learning curve for all of us. Just those interactions are a little different. Question.
Thanks for answering.
Can I ask you?
Yep.
So my question is, if you have the students put something up in front of a screen, like a piece of paper, is there a way for them to take the majority of the screen? Because right now, if you were holding something up in front of a screen, I'd never be able to read it. No one else would either, I don't think, because you're a small portion of the screen. But is there a way, boom, now you're the main event? Yeah,
as you're the host within this, you can come up and if you go you're all on Google Classroom right now. If you go into the 3 dots, Leslie, do this. So you can do this for your room. Every one of you can do this. Whoever's manning your computer in that room, go to move your cursor on your screen, and you will see the white bar pop up at the bottom. Go all the way to the right and see the 3 dots.
Yep.
Click those 3 dots, and you will come up and you'll see I don't know that you see stop recording at the top, but if you see change layout.
Yeah.
Go to the change layout. Okay.
Yeah.
And you can you can do a couple of things here. You can change to, at this point, one of 3 different, you can do a sidebar, you can do a spotlight, or you can do the tiled view. Okay, so you can set any of those views up. The other way to do this is go in and put your cursor over any one of the 4 screens that you see, and now you can pin that. If you put your cursor over the screen, you'll see a button come up that says, I don't think yours says mute, I think only because I'm host, but you'll see what looks like a thumbtack, something that looks like if you hit that thumbtack, you can pin that screen so that it's the only one that is seen. And now that will...
But I will say that's a challenge here, Richard, only in that you're the one that's sharing the PowerPoint. So no matter what we do, you wouldn't be able to see a kid. That having been said, that was one of the advantages of our many formats. GoToMeeting you can put it on a setting to allow whoever is speaking to be the predominant person on the screen, so that if
Right.
that student was speaking, you'd see them big. Right now, I can't make any of us big. I can make us small. I can make us all equal, but I can't make anybody but you big. Oh, look there.
Now you can. When I stop, if
Yeah.
I stop presenting, now
Right.
you can pin
Right.
somebody to the main screen.
Right. And you,
I had no trouble. I had no trouble pinning, even when you were before you changed that setting. It was working just as you said. I don't know why it wasn't working for Leslie, but it was.
No,
working.
no.
You're right, that's different when you're presenting.
oh, I got it, because I could pin myself from the sidebar. Yes, I could pin myself. Yeah,
So
so
what
then, but the instructor would have to keep changing who they're pinning in that case to be able to see a student big. Some of the other platforms will always just focus on who's talking.
Right. Right. In fact, one of the algorithms that's set up for Google Hangouts, we kind of watched this. Right now there's only 5 groups in here, 5 screens up. Google will handle, one of the neat things about Google is it will handle up to 250 people or 250 entries without degrading the signal. That's one of the advantages of it. But you can only see, if you put it in the tile view, you can only see 16 people at a time, or 16 screens at a time. So if you have a class larger than 16, only the last 16 people who have talked will show up on the screen unless you go in and pin them out. So you can go into the show everyone view, and it will show the different groups in here, and you can pin them from that as well. In other words, if you look at the upper right-hand menu of the screen, you see the little thumbnail of your screen or yourself. You'll see the clock. You'll see the chat function, which you can also have students use. And you can see the 5 groups that are in here, and you can show everybody. And if you click on that, then it just shows a list of everybody. And now you can work through everybody that's in that class. How many do you have in any particular class?
It could range from 5 to 25.
Yeah. So if you're over the 16, you're not going to see everybody unless you start to pin them back up or they respond. The way Google has this set, their algorithm is set that the last 16 people that talk will show up on the screen. That's just the way they've got it set. There's a limitation with that. Zoom is a little different. It will allow you to scroll through multiple screens. So in other words, if you've got 32 or 48 people, so you'll have 3 screens of 16, you can scroll through those. Google Meets does not allow you to do that at this point. Okay, other questions at this point?
You can't, I couldn't on my tablet.
Can I ask a question?
You can ask anything you wish.
Okay, so we were talking about students showing their faces on the screen. We had discussed, some of us were under the impression that that's illegal to require them to show their faces in an online class. What is your understanding of that?
I'm sorry, I only caught about half of that. In other words, there's a question of having them show their faces.
Right. Is it illegal for us to require that in our class, that you must not put up your icon, but we have to be able to see you when we're having a live class?
No, I don't believe that it's illegal. I've never heard anything like that. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I have never heard or seen anything like that. It's no different if you think, well, it is different. I'll put that caveat here in a minute. But in the respect of, you see their face when they're in your classroom. This is really no different in that respect. What is different is, and this is some level of a limitation, and I've heard this, and I had shared this with Leslie, we talked about it the other day. If you have certain students who live in certain conditions, and now you're going into their home, you see them in class, that's one thing. But to see into their home, that becomes another. And if you see certain conditions and certain things, certain abuses, certain social conditions, I don't know. The question is, do you have a duty to report that? And now this opens you up to other things. But, that's the only other question that I would have. To assist our students to learn from a pure learning point of view, I want to see them. I want to see their face. I want to see the work. I want to see what they're doing. That's, the way that I teach. That's the way that I interact. If you can do it asynchronously, great. But, you're dealing with a large number of students and you're dealing with a large volume of content that you have to cover within 180 plus period, 180 plus days per year. So you need to interact with them in a routine, regular basis, the same way that you do in face-to-face. And interacting with them less means you cover less material. Would you agree with that?
I would offer this, Richard. I think that's an internal question, but I would say there are so many circumstances that while we can set the expectation and ask them to be there, I can't tell you how many times I was on with a class and they could get the picture, but they couldn't get the sound. They finally had to shut it all off, go only to their phone. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them and they could see me, but they couldn't get the tech up running sometimes for my kids.
Yeah.
So there's a million glitches that could happen. That having been said, I think we can set an expectation. I just wouldn't go to a demand because you never know what their problem is on their home internet today. And if mom and dad are working at home and everybody's sucking bandwidth, they might not be able to get a photo.
That's the other thing that is absolutely problematic. And that's something that in higher education, we do not generally suffer. Although I'll be honest with you, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of the last 6 months working from my dining room table. And I have a number of meetings and classes and everything else. And, my son, who is still at home, runs 3 or 4 different things. My wife is, on computer and on an iPad and on this and a cell phone. Every one of us are running at least 3 things off of our internet. And there are times that it has degraded my signal down. And you're absolutely right. That's problematic. That's been problematic when they don't have the same technology across the board, nor do you have an IT department that can provide help desk assistance. So this is where I said yesterday that we as teachers generally become the first line of defense for any technology-based problems. There are some options. You can have students, especially in Google Meet, you can have them call in. There is also an app on the cell phone. I would probably argue that the majority of students these days, I'm not sure how far down in the lower grade students carry cell phones these days, but I think it's lower and lower every year. They can access a Google Meets through a Google Meets app. It's a very powerful, in fact, sometimes, and I've done several meetings, and I haven't done classes because I work off the computer quite heavily for that, with PowerPoints and other materials, electronic. But some meetings I have done them through my cell phone, and they have been just fine. And it's just a good way to communicate and good way to interact as in a pinch. So Leslie, that may be something that you can do, but you're absolutely right. You're suffering from the fact that you haven't provided every student with a universal size laptop or Chromebook or whatever else that you're utilizing. And they don't all have the same bandwidth or the same, and we suffer from some of that as well. I've had students in distance education classes that, they were from Beaver County and some of their bandwidth was not all that great out there. And so we had some students that kept dropping it off. It's just a reality of working within this that, everybody isn't going to have the same access to technology or the same, solid technology that we don't even have to worry about it. I mean, the key thing that we want is to make technology seamless, but that's not always possible. It's not always possible.
I might suggest just internally another way to maybe promote that is, and I didn't do this every time when I met live with my class, but I did it sometimes and I did it less as time went on. Like I requested, for instance, for our first online real live synchronous class meeting, I said, everybody wear a hat. And that was kind of fun. And then for another one, I said, everybody write up a sign of encouragement and we'll all hold those up and read those. So I tried to do something that would draw everybody into it. And I actually had a fair amount of success with people pretty much always being present, being visible, because I would add these little things that would make it kind of fun and playful. And that was a lot of fun.
Well, that's the key thing. And I think you want to have fun. You want to make sure that this is fun for you, and you want to make sure it's fun for the students. And you're right, that is a challenge when you have technology issues that students can't access to it. So did I answer your question before? The lady that, yeah, okay.
Can I just throw something in?
Yeah.
I set, and maybe it's because your PowerPoint isn't up, but I don't think so. I went to change layout and set it to spotlight.
Yes.
And as you and others have been talking, it's been automatically switching my screen to whoever's talking. So that is a,
yeah. If you've got it to spotlight, that means you only have one person up, and whoever is talking, that's the algorithm that's set within how they have structured this, that whoever is speaking will take center stage, and that just moves the next person down the line. So if you go to the Brady Bunch view or the tile view, it'll move people down within that sequence. But if you do move that, then it highlights and spotlights somebody speaking. You can do that same thing within the presentation, and it will do, I believe it does the two screen thing. Other questions? Okay, please, as we do not hesitate to jump in. We can certainly spend whatever time we need to kind of work through specific issues. Okay. All right, I'm presenting again. So you can go ahead and try and play on your end to see how you can get certain views with this with a synchronous session. But you should, is everybody seeing my PowerPoint again? Just want to double check.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Just to move on, that conversational tone, students are more motivated when a conversation is used over that impersonal textbook character, the stereo instruction kind of thing. I think you utilize this conversational tone not only in the audio and the way Leslie was talking about, just have some fun with certain things, but it can be accomplished through assignments, comments, can be accomplished through telephone, email, discussion boards, any type of audio and or text-based conversation that you're having. Can be used in printed, recorded presentations, you know, just the way that you present certain intricacies of the subject, certain things that you know that you traditionally do, or the ways that you do it, you can do those same kind of things through narration, through audio, through text. And I think what this does, you know, one of the things that we know from the literature is that students learn when they feel that they belong to something. When they don't feel that they belong to the class, or they're making that connection, then we lose them. And they don't learn because they're not part of that. So that conversational approach helps them to generate those feelings of belonging to certain situations and to the learning situation, if you will. The key element is to communicate in the online as you would in the face-to-face, understanding that there are certain caveats and certain shortfalls that go with that, because everybody isn't in a social setting. You're not sitting next to somebody. I'm sitting in my dining room by myself. You're sitting in a classroom with a few others, but not everybody. So it's not the same thing. So we have to be aware of that. The student empathy requires that speedy return of assignments the same way that we do in face-to-face, but I think it does get exacerbated in the online. The students want more conversational comment. They want more feedback because they don't get it. They get a lot of feedback from you in the face-to-face. You walk around, you interact with them. But when we move to a technology-based, sometimes some of that gets lost, and there's not as much with that. I think one of the we need to do, and Kohlberg talks about this, the students need greater access to you as the instructor when you move to an online format. They need greater access to you. And I think this is where we've read and heard over the last 6 months and maybe last spring, where some students didn't feel that they were getting as much because they didn't have access to the instructor. There were technological issues, which I think most are trying to get past. You guys are obviously doing those kind of things. You use that friendly personal tone and supportive feedback, and the students now feel or begin to feel more of that sense of what they get in the face-to-face. Okay. Let me go back to that bullet before, greater access to the instructor. This really does, and this is why a lot of people will shy away from teaching in the online environment. And I've seen and heard this because teaching in the online environment takes up anywhere from 2 to 3 times more than what you do when you're teaching face-to-face. In any class that I teach, at the graduate, doctoral, and undergraduate level, we teach anywhere from an hour a day to 4 hours a day. So if I'm teaching a 4-hour class on a Monday evening, I'm focused on that class for that 4 hours. And short of any other interactions through an email or whatever, I don't spend a tremendous amount of time in that course until the next lesson comes through a week later. But when I'm teaching an online version of that particular course, I now spend almost 7 days a week dealing with something in that course. So your interaction and the work becomes greater. And I really believe the literature says 2 to 3 times. I would probably argue it's more like 3 to 4 times. And this is why some people will shy away from this, but there's just a lot that has to go into it because now we're dealing with a lot of one-on-one, whereas we were dealing with one-on 20, 25. Now we have to do that one-on-one with the student. So it does take us more time for that. So what does this look like, when we communicate through these kind of things? So let's look at some examples. What I structure and do, and we'll talk about this later if we have the time, is I do a lot with introductions, announcements. I do, if I'm posting through an asynchronous format, I do a fair amount with a weekly focus. Some of you may call that an anticipatory sets of sorts, letting students know what they're coming to or what they're going to learn about. You do this through your emails, you do this through the discussion boards, you do this through any kind of text-based and or audio type of communication. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. This is generally an opening introductory email that I send out to students, and if you read through it, I'm not going to read through that whole thing, but it just say, hello and welcome to EDUC 6120 Instructional Leadership Management. This is fully online course, blah, 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 blah. And I start to use and start to move into more of a conversational tone. Please know that while this is an online course, you are not alone. I'm always available to answer questions through email and phone as necessary to assist you in your learning. The key element is to talk to them in the text format the same way that you would talk to them if they were sitting in front of you. Now, that's not always an easy thing to do because when we write, our persona is a little different. When I write something, my persona is much different. I write more formally than I speak. You need to be aware of that and think, who's going to read this? This is part of that instructor empathy. Think who is going to be reading this. When I first started teaching in the online, I really didn't have any training. I was asked to teach an online course and I was told, here, it starts next week, and I had no idea what that meant. And the only way that I think I survived, and maybe my students survived my first teaching online, this goes back years ago, it was 1997 actually, was that as I'm sitting in my office developing these lessons and developing this, I started thinking, okay, if I'm writing this, how are my students going to receive it? And what are they reading? In other words, is this clear? Am I saying what I want to say, or am I saying what I would say if they were sitting in front of me? So that was part of that empathy thing, and it did help make a difference for me. Announcements. What I do is I will announce things. I will put an announcement in place, and you can certainly do this in Google Classrooms. And here's what I would tell you, because my sense of where I think you folks are going with this right now is you're having more of a blended. You're trying to do as much face-to-face as you possibly can, correct?
Yes. Yes.
With the idea that you're going to augment at some point with some asynchronous and possibly some synchronous classrooms, correct?
If required to do so.
If you're required to do this. So what I would tell you is if you're going to move things, or you're forced to move things, or it becomes imperative that you do so, I would tell you you're going to do synchronous, but you're also going to augment your synchronous by posting your materials through an asynchronous format. This is where you're going to use not only the Google Meets, but you're going to use the Google Classrooms to post materials, post your narrated PowerPoints, post your handouts, post your readings, post your assignments, post a lot of different things that you would use as hard copy in class. You're now having to put them up as electronic. And in doing so, you're now going to have to provide instruction. Instruction that you would give verbally to students in class, you now have to put up online through your asynchronous. So students are going to read your instructions. You now need to make sure that you have a much higher level of clarity in what you write, because this is where the students are going to get confused. So make sure that your instructions are clear as to what you're going to do, why you're doing it, and what you want them to do. And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is navigation of your course shell, however you structure that. And here's something that I would probably tell you, Leslie, and this is for you guys to think about and for everybody, but as you are doing all of your face-to-face materials right now, you may want to augment and utilize your Google Classrooms to augment some of your face-to-face. Get your students, while you've got them in front of you in your class, get them used to working asynchronously. In other words, augment what's going on so that you put all of your materials up online. Do your students all have access to computers while they're in your classroom?
No.
Okay. Do they have access to computers at home generally?
Generally, yes. So our plan, Richard, is that we're getting all kids into the Google Classroom within the first week. And like when a kid is absent, that is how they will access all of the course content, is through the classroom.
Perfect. And I think what that does is I think it does everything you want it to do. It helps to prepare your students. It helps them to get them thinking in that way. And it helps you to start designing your online lessons and moving those. And you may start to realize that you can integrate those things in a very nice blended way, even when things go back to normal, if they ever go back to normal, and whatever normal means. But if you look at this, I always start things off with an announcement. And again, I try and use that conversational tone. I try and write the way I talk and just give them information and give them communications. And these are just from courses that I've taught. Now, these are higher ed, but you get the general idea of how I'm attempting to communicate with my students. You have to communicate with your students the same way that you would in the face-to-face. So the way you would talk to a high school student, a middle school student, or any level in the elementary grades, early childhood, these are all things that you do appropriately. You type those words appropriately as well for them. What's appropriate for high school is not appropriate for a third grade classroom, not appropriate for kindergarten. You have to speak as you would, and you have to write appropriately. Plus, you also have to take into consideration how the parents who are going to be assisting with certain levels and grades are also going to be working and reviewing this. One of the things that I start with through each week and lesson, and you do the same thing in your face-to-face classes, but when you put them online, you need to start with, and I always start with something called a weekly focus. And I will say, hey, welcome to week 8. Welcome to the final week of class. It's been a fast, but hopefully fun run that has allowed you to learn some different ideas about how to develop and integrate technology, blah, blah. This is from a tech-based class that I was teaching. We're also going to take a look and discuss some blended learning techniques, blended learning, blah, blah, and this is similar to what we're doing in this session. But you just start talking and start introducing what you're doing, and you talk in that, or you type in that conversational tone. But that weekly focus lays out what you're going to do. And exactly. So I always say, if you look at the third paragraph, it says, this week we have some activities, readings, presentations, and web reviews that will help put this all into perspective and provide you an understanding of the options and implications for education and learners. You just lay out again what you're doing. Now, this is talking to a level of graduate students, but you would utilize the appropriate language for your group. Please, Leslie, go ahead.
Richard, one of the suggestions that was made, we had put out a survey. I don't know why I get feedback. We had put out a survey to our families regarding their experience in the spring. And one of the suggestions that was made, and this would be, I would say, the lower school equivalent to what you have on the screen, is there was a parent suggestion that said, wouldn't it be great if at the beginning of the day, now this was if we were to move, if we were forced to be remote, if the very first video of the day was the lower school teacher saying, this is what the day is going to be. These are all the things that you need to do today, even aside from the actual video where they taught their lesson, but laying that out for the student, because then the student themselves can listen to that since they're not readers necessarily yet. And they can listen to that. They know what the expectations are for the day. And then the parent can one by one connect them to each lesson. But now the little kid knows, okay, these are the things that I'm going to have to do today. And they're not as much at the mercy of mom and dad having to direct every part of it, because they heard the teacher tell them all the things that we're going to do today, or that are expected.
Which is no different than what the teacher would do in a face-to-face setting. You
Right.
would start the day saying, hey, we're going to do this and this and this. And yes, you can create those videos utilizing Google Meets. It's a very easy thing to do.
Yeah.
You just simply record those and you upload them to your shell. I think it's an excellent idea. It's, again, though, and I will tell you, it takes time. That's production on the part of every one of your teachers.
Yeah.
All of you, this now becomes production. And you want to get into routines and how you do those things. And these are not hard to do, but you just, initially it's just production. That's all. So I like the idea, Leslie. I think it probably would serve not only all of you, but it would serve your students well. And I think it would remove a lot of stress. You know, it would remove stress from the parents. It would remove stress from the students. And it becomes more normalized for them because they hear you. And this goes back to what we were talking about before. They make that connection because they're hearing the teacher. No, they're not. It's not real time, but they're still hearing that teacher, and they're hearing the teacher's voice, and they're making that connection. And there is a rapport that does develop. So yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. I truly do. Okay. And again, I would probably argue it's not always, none of this is one size fits all. I am not a believer, and never have been, in a template approach to any of this, but I think there are always best practices that can be employed. And every one of you need to know your group. You need to understand who they are and what you can best do for some of those. Emails. How many are you communicating with students through email?
Yes, the older ones, not necessarily the younger ones.
Are you communicating with parents in the younger grades through emails?
Yes.
Okay. So a lot of this then becomes the same kind of thing. You want to develop a rapport with, you know, with the families, with the parents, with the kids. And it's a matter of who you're communicating with, how you communicate with them. You know, the same way that you answer questions, you know, like I received this one. I received this one. Hi, Dr. Fuller. I'm a little confused about how to structure my discussion board post for this week. Do you want me to address blah? And she just asked a simple question. And I just wrote back, yep, it's all in how you communicate. And I try to talk in less formal manners. And sometimes that just helps to make those connections. And the student walks away from this even simple, short communication feeling I've made that connection. I have a rapport with my instructor. They've made, you know, whatever accommodations for me. You just simply do those things. And a lot of times you're solving issues and problems in a very quick email. Okay, that's one of the reasons I walk around with a cell phone and Saturday afternoon in Giant Eagle, I'm answering questions like that. Very simple things to do. All right, so let's do a quick exercise, if we would, and questions to ask yourself, things to think about from your own perspective and your own teaching and online. So the question is, how would students see my online communications? So if they looked at your communications right now, what would they see? How would they react to it? Do I use a conversational tone, or are my communications more rigid? And maybe you can think of some examples that you've done. Do I communicate in the online the same way that I do in the face-to-face? Maybe think about listing out some examples. Do my online audio communications also reflect a conversational tone? By audio communications, I mean real-time synchronous, as well as maybe the asynchronous narrations or videos that you're doing. The videos that Leslie's talking about doing, you know, where you start the day saying, okay, today we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. That's part of that communication. Do they all reflect a conversational tone, or am I too rigid in how I'm communicating? Again, list some examples of what you do. What do you think would be the effect of the conversational tone in your online classes? Okay. And here's the other thing I will ask you, and things, whether you're doing this, I would say, am I present enough? You're present in your face-to-face classes, but are you present enough in what you're doing through synchronous and asynchronous communications? And maybe what are some of the things that I can do to be more present? So let's take about 3-4 minutes, see what you can come up with and see what examples that you have, and then maybe we'll do some sharing within the groups, given time. How would your students see your communications? Let me just ask though, let's just do this in group because of the time. We've only got about 45 minutes left. How would your students see your communications? Anybody want to share? How do you communicate with your students?
Because I would do it in person class. So I was just sharing, Richard, that in my calc class, I actually began every day on the Google board, but we were also using our in-school thing called the backpack. I literally would start my correspondence with the day by saying, good morning. Now I only had 14 students. I named them by name and I changed the order every day. And then I always start class with a prayer. So I would say, let's pray. And I typed up some prayer. Today, let's remember to pray for all the people who are dying from this pandemic, all the people who are cooped up. Like I literally typed we start every class with a prayer. I literally typed out my prayer every day. And then I went into what we were doing. And I felt like that helped it was identical to what I would have done if I was in the classroom. And I felt like that kept it very personal, which might be why really, for the most part, they were all always on, because it was my absolute normal everyday routine. Every day when they went through the backpack, they saw that. So that for me was helpful.
I have to ask, is Aquinas a faith-based institution?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. That is perfect. So that allows you to do those things, and this is now something that also helps to make that connection. I think that is absolutely spectacular. And if you're able to transition that from what you do in the classroom to the online, that is absolutely wonderful. And the students make that same connection. To open up with a prayer as you would in your classroom and to do the exact same thing in your synchronous session. Even to do something like that in your online asynchronous is a positive thing. Oh, very good. What other examples has anybody else done or doing as far as utilization of communications and conversational tones?
Again?
I would make agenda videos every week to tell them, like, for 4th, 5th, and 6th, and I would record myself doing something silly, but then talk about the agendas for the week.
So Ryan did the agenda for the week and always laid that
They would be able
out.
to see me each week. At the beginning of each week, they would see my face. I could explain the assignments a little bit better so they would know what the expectations were.
Yeah, I think those personalized explanations from the teacher as to what you're doing in a video like this is very good. And if you're not comfortable doing the video, you can certainly do that in a text-based, but keep those communications not so rigid, but keep them more open-ended. I think that's a positive thing. Okay, very good. Very good. Others? Anybody else have anything to share in any of the other groups? Okay, let's move on then, just in the interest of time, because there's some things I'd like to cover. Let's talk a little bit about online classroom management, how you structure an LMS. This becomes a key element to how you do things, and navigation becomes a large part of this. I want you to think about your LMS. Think about how you structure and set up your Google Classrooms. It's the same way that you organize. One of the things that we were talking about before is establishing routines, establishing expectations. I would argue that every one of you have set down routines for your students. They know that when they go into one class, there are certain expectations that are had. I know that I have to go in, I have to do this and this and this and this. I go to my next teacher's class, their routine is a little different, but it is still a routine that I know. You want to establish the exact same thing in your LMS so that when a student enters into your particular course shell, they have access to a whole bunch of different things and they know where to go and what to do. This is routine. Now, you're going to be planning to do a combination at some point of synchronous and asynchronous. So you want to establish a set of routines or a set of expectations that the students know the flow. They know when they come into your online class, they know exactly where to go. They know exactly what to do. Because they walk in, you're going to have an announcement. You may have some kind of a course map or a syllabus. They can go into course materials, whatever the lessons are for the day. In other words, if I know that today I have these things and I'm going to go and I know exactly where to go to get Mr. Gracie's video or his write-up for what's going on today, I know where to go get that. I know that he's going to post something up every day or every other day or once a week or however he structures it and does it. So that I know that when I go into his course, I know exactly where I'm supposed to go and exactly what I'm supposed to do. And I know he's going to lay out the expectations of what he wants me to accomplish for that particular day, that particular lesson. You may have, and I always put my stuff under a topics of study so students know when they go into my course, I'm going to start with a weekly announcement or a daily announcement. And they go to my lesson and I will have a weekly focus. And then they will have under topics of study, they will have lessons. I have places for assignments. I will have communications. There will be discussion boards. Everything will be linked out a certain way. There's certain structure and expectations that are put in place so that the students know and can see what needs to be done. You know, maybe where you're going to post grade books, drop boxes, calendars, whatever. And every one of the LMSs, Google Classroom included, has most of these things. And you can set certain things up and structure lessons in certain ways. Put things in folders, organize certain. This becomes the expectation of what you're looking to establish for all of your students so that you create a set of routines, if you would. And the students now have expectations of you. They expect that you're going to post certain things. And this now makes navigation a very, very easy thing to do. Okay, they can navigate your lesson. They know exactly where to go and what to do. Okay? Keep it simple is what I would probably tell you to do. So the classroom management is really not discipline, but it's basically how we structure the learning to make sense to the learner. It's how you lay things out and it's what you do. Good online classroom management has a structure that promotes the learner to learn. If the learner, and this goes back to Leslie's point before, if the learner is focused on technological issues, then what aren't they doing? What aren't they focused on? They're not focused on the content. They're not focused on the learning. If, however, they get into your classroom and they don't know where to go or they don't know what to do and they don't know where to find things, then they're focused on navigation and they're confused and they're spending all of their time worried about where I have to go, what I have to do, how do I have to get there. So they want to figure out the best way to get into the material. The question. Somebody move to the mic. Do you have a question?
No,
I'll take that.
was me, but no.
Okay. All right. So the key element is to have them interact. This is part of that interaction with the content. Other students and the instructor, we want to lay things out so that it's very, very clear how the student is able to access content, where they're able to access it. And now we've established a certain routine for those students so that they know where to go. and they don't have any question. When they jump onto your shell, your Google Classroom shell, they know exactly where to go and exactly what to do, and you will post new material there. So they're going to be able to see it. So that's part of the routine. Now, I want to talk a little bit about instructor controls versus student controls. When we talk about the terms pedagogy versus andragogy, pedagogy, the root word is peds, it's the art and science of teaching children. The andragogy is from the Greek andros, or man, and it just talks about, it's just adult learning. It's how adults learn, basically. And it's different theories. Initially, it was set down by Malcolm Knowles, and if you've not read any of his materials, they're pretty interesting reads. Malcolm Knowles talked about the idea of adult learning theory, and that adults are more self-directed, okay? And adults want more learner controls or learning controls in that respect. The pedagogical end of things is the art and science of teaching kids, and we generally find that to be a little bit more teacher-centric, more instructor controls on how and when materials and things are released. The whole idea behind this is, in Malcolm Knowles passed away in 1998, but one of the things that he said in one of his last interviews was that the art and science of teaching adults is just another educational theory. And what we generally find is that kids are very self-directed in their approach to learning anyway. Think about it. Kids, they're involved in dance, or involved in scouting, involved in sports. All of these are learning opportunities. So these are things that they are self-directed towards. So he said that, the whole learning theory idea of adults is not just for adults, because kids are self-directed as well. So the key element is we want to help our students become more self-directed. But when we start looking at learner controls, when we start looking at how much control to do, we have to figure out, when do we release and when do we not release information? How do we structure certain things for our students and how do we not? The amount of structure really varies from teacher to teacher, from content to content, from student to student. It's based upon what those learner needs are. And it varies from very little control, where you have just open access to the materials and students can be very self-directed, to a highly structured with very strong controls. One of the things that is available, and it's not available in Google Classrooms, I believe, but it is available in Blackboard. And I think Blackboard's one of the few that has it. It's something called adaptive release. Adaptive release is just where we can put certain parameters on that a student can't see B until they have clicked on A. Okay. I utilize it to some degree, but basically it's how we release material. And think about this. You're not going to throw out all of your lessons and materials for all 180 days to students. You release them day by day. So that's basically a highly structured kind of a focus, because let's go to the elementary grades. That a student can't learn how to multiply until they've learned how to add and subtract. They can't learn how to subtract until they've learned how to add. So we know certain pieces of information have to be released logically in such a way so that the students can learn logically and can process the information. Other topics we can release a little more openly. So the structure, how tight or how loose, is dependent upon the students, it's dependent upon the subject, it's dependent upon the teacher. One of the advantages of any kind of online, however, is a certain level of learner control, or andragogy, if you would. But again, that is totally dependent, but it's something for you as instructors to think about as you're developing online materials and online lessons. Course format, much of it is based upon the type of course. Again, foundational courses, skills-based courses, analysis, synthesis that we talked about yesterday. Foundational courses probably have more structure, simply because we know if they don't get the foundational material, they're going to be lost in later lessons, later materials. So we want very basic things. So we want high structure in what they're doing. Skills-based classes, for the most part, probably also have very high structure. We do a lot of direct teaching, a lot of direct instruction. So again, I want very high structure in how material and information is released, and it's released in some kind of chronological order. We do this in the face-to-face. Again, this is done in the online. Analysis synthesis, however, maybe certain aspects of that have looser controls. simply because we're asking the students to analyze things and then synthesize them into their own areas and into synthesized in their own ideas. So maybe we provide a little bit less structure there and give them a little bit more learner control in those settings. And you can do this in the online as much as you can do the on ground. So an exercise, I want you to think of your lessons. Think of a lesson. Take the lesson that you taught or that you put together yesterday. Which would be best taught with tighter controls and which would generate greater advantage with more learner control? Think of the lessons that you teach. Think of the lessons throughout your year. Which would be tighter control? Which would be looser control? And why? What's the advantage of that? And if we could, I'd like to share a couple of examples on that if we can. I'd like to get one example from each room if we could. That would make things easy. If anybody wishes to share, please, let's do so.
We were just saying in our room that although then again, I'm sitting in a room full of STEM-based people, science and math, where sometimes putting stuff out ahead of time. So for any of those classes, whether it's at the elementary or not, it's not always helpful because they don't have the content yet. They need to think ahead to what will be due on Friday because it's so specific. So there we need tighter controls because in the STEM classes, we need tighter controls because it is completely knowledge dependent.
I agree. In fact, learning certain things out of sequence and out of order does the student more harm.
Yeah.
They don't get the basic processes. You can't learn C before you learn A before you learn B. It doesn't make sense. So you need to know and understand that and make sure that those things are set down. So that's why maybe you have those tighter controls inserting. But I might argue that there are certain things that you can provide more learner controls on. Once they have basics, once they have structure, maybe if you're looking for assignments with applications, now maybe you can provide certain learner parameters of control. Okay. Other groups, other subject areas. We've heard from the STEM. What about from the English, the literature, that group?
So one of our history teachers has students build a castle, and that requires very loose control.
You mean physically build a castle?
They're learning how to do it.
Yeah.
Feudalism.
Cool. So that's tighter controls?
No, loose.
Looser controls. In other words, allow them a certain level of creativity with that.
Exactly.
You put down certain parameters that they work within, but then you give them certain flexibility and freedom to do that. Very good. And those are things that can be done. Other groups.
So in regards to teaching Latin, so many of the things that we do are grammar-based instruction and syntactical analysis and building different stems and understanding the components of endings. But we do have the ability at times to turn it over to the kids to begin to generate their own sentence content at a much later point. The students can take that knowledge and really begin to write their own sentences in the target language. And as a result, use a little bit more creativity on their end. And then also, demonstrate to the class how they did it, their own process in the composition.
Yeah. This translates very nicely to the online as well. There are certain times in the online lessons you give a certain amount of freedom of what they do and how they do it. But you may keep certain tighter structures on when they do it. So that's, again, the instructor read, and this doesn't change in the online as well. Anybody have an example from Mr. Birchel's classroom?
Okay, go ahead.
Project-based learning is a looser control.
I agree with that. I agree. How many of you, but you have certain parameters of assignments, you have certain parameters. The project base comes through, you've provided a certain amount of instruction, and now you're giving them the opportunity through, now do you do that as a group work, or do you do that individually? Or combinations thereof?
Combination.
How would you do that? How would you structure that and do that through an asynchronous or a synchronous modality? If you were having them work in groups together, how would you structure and get them to do that in groups through an online format?
So I had done something in the spring where I had put them into small groups and assigned certain questions to each group, and just through Google Docs, maybe so that they could edit and respond to one another's comments.
Perfect. Google Docs is one of those tools that a lot of people shy away from, but it is a tremendous interactive tool that can be used. It's one of those things that you can use that in conjunction with a synchronous session where you can break students out and have them in groups work on a document. And if you provide access to that document, they can all work on the document at the same time or have input to it. This becomes project-based. It also becomes group-based. And these are very, very important things. And that's where you would probably give some looser controls as to what you want them to do or how to do it. Maybe you put certain structures in place, but you provide a little looser control for them as far as how and what they do. This is part of the things that we think about in the online and things that we need to do. These are great examples, and that's why I wanted everybody to share, because you're coming from different perspectives on things of what can be tight, what can be loose as far as your structure. Navigation, some things to think about. Your shell portals have some innate properties. Google Classrooms has some innate properties built in that provide what I call a think forward type consistency or think forward structure. And this is what I was talking about before with the routine. As students enter into your classroom, they have routine. When they enter into your shell, you need to have the same consistent structures. And I'm not saying that you need to have a template approach. Every one of you don't have to have the exact same look to your shell. In fact, I will tell you, I think that gets boring. If students look at your shell and they look at your the next teacher's shell and they're the exact same thing, it gets boring. You don't have to have the exact same template for every classroom, but you do have to have that think forward type thing, that there's a consistency. The way you structure it is the way you should keep it so that the students have that routine. You need to have that level of redundancy so that students know what you expect, know where to go, and then there becomes that level of clarity. Mr. Salinas's class does not have to be the same as Mr. Birchel's class. They can be different, okay? But you do need to provide consistency so that what you do, and if you're going to change something, make sure that they know what you're doing. The lessons and the modules need to be laid out with similarity from week to week, day to day, so the students don't have to get used to different new formats. That becomes confusing for them. Think about it. When you change your room around in a face-to-face setting, if you change something around, sometimes that's a good thing, but other times it just confuses students, so they don't get into that routine. It allows students to become comfortable with structure, and you provide that consistency of flow, clarity of directions, using the conversational tone. And the one thing that I do, and I believe Google Classrooms allows, is you can provide hyperlinks. In other words, that link things. Think of a good web page that you've gone to. You can provide navigation from one place to the next so that the move through your Google Classroom becomes very, very consistent. So the students don't get lost somewhere in. And again, if they get lost in your page, then they're focused on your navigation and they're wasting time doing that. The same way that they have technological problems, they're focused on that. So you want to keep it as simple as possible. Utilize the simple things, utilize universal things. That's why I always say use Word documents, use PDFs, use PowerPoint, because the majority of people have access to those things. Utilize YouTube's videos because the majority of people can access those things with little navigational issues. Keep your structure consistent so that they're not focused on navigation or technology issues, that they're focused on they can get to your content faster and they know where to go and what to do. That becomes key. The design and flow of a course is a direct result of the instructor's personality and the content that is to be delivered. If it makes sense to the instructor, it will make sense to the students. Okay, that's generally what I say. I use announcements and I sometimes send them out as emails as well that will really link to a specific kind of a topic of study area. So I keep a consistent structure. I utilize a modular or a weekly lesson format. How you break that down is up to you. You know, how and what makes sense to you and what makes sense to your content and how you break it down. You know, the way the STEM will do it, the way the English will do it, the way the history will all be different, but that's okay. You get into that format. The basic thing with this is just a lot of this is just a flow of your course. Okay, it is just how you are flowing from beginning to end. Much like you start with an anticipatory set, you move through your lessons, you move through all of this, again, keeping that conversational tone. All right, let's talk a little bit about time, because this is one of those things that, you know, when you move to the online, sometimes, and I will tell you, when I first started teaching online, I thought more was better. More is not always better. And in fact, one of the things that I had done is I thought, oh, great, I've got this platform. Now I can just load up all these resources. Well, students felt that if it was important enough for me to load it up, that it must be important enough for them to spend time reading it or watching it or doing it. And that wasn't my intention. I was giving a lot more, if you want to think about it, I was giving looser learner controls on this, but I didn't give the initial parameters. And that was a mistake because students didn't know. They had to kind of triage what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and they didn't know. So you need to be careful about posting up too much because it's really quite easy to say, hey, read this, do this, do this, do this. You need to understand the time frame. So work with the time frames that you structure within your classroom. You know how much time it takes a student to do certain things. How much time is it going to take them to do this assignment? How much time is it going to take them to read this? How much time is it going to take them to listen to your narrated PowerPoint or to do a discussion or to answer questions or to do whatever? Work backwards from your face-to-face in how much you're structuring in your online. Sometimes that's not an easy thing to do, but if you work off of your face-to-face as the parameter, it may make things a little bit easier as far as how much material you post up there. You know, generally speaking, you want to have material for the class time and then at least, some people will say 2 hours material beyond. It depends upon the class, depends upon everything. So that's just kind of a general nomer. Questions about time? Because that's generally one that many teachers have questions about. How much material is too much? How much is too little? I think the general word is you kind of have to play with that, especially with the online. Okay. Couple words about voiceover narrated PowerPoints. They're easy to develop, they're easy to do, they're easy to post. You generally want to keep them short. I would probably say no more than maybe 10 minutes plus minus. Rarely more than 30 minutes if needed, but you need to have activities built in for students to stop and go do something or take breaks through that. Because listening sometimes just to the talking head, the narrated PowerPoint, no matter how good you are with your voiceovers, they can lose their effectiveness for learners. So one of the things that the narrated PowerPoint does over the teacher standing in front of the room is that it gives the student greater learner control. Think about this. They can't stop when you're standing in front of them, or even if you're doing a synchronous presentation like this, you can't stop. They can't stop and rewind you. They may try, but they can't stop and rewind you. But if you're doing a narrated PowerPoint or you're doing some kind of a video of what you're doing, now this gives them greater learner control that they can stop, they can repeat what you just said so that they can get more control, and they can say, well, I understand this, so they can move ahead on something. So there is greater value. I saw this value years and years and years ago. I was monitoring a student teacher over in Fox Chapel years ago. And the student teacher was working with a cooperating teacher who utilized kind of a blended learning approach where they provided narrated PowerPoints and videos for things. And I was quite interested because it was one of the first times I'd seen that utilized within a classroom. They had a block schedule of about 75 minutes, I believe. And the teacher was standing in front of the room and they were saying, okay, we're doing this and this and this. She had activities. She was explaining things. She says, okay, everybody please go onto the LMS. And I think at the time they were using Moodle. And she said, okay, everybody go on and I want you to listen to the lecture. And the lecture was about a 15-minute narrated PowerPoint that the teacher had created. And the students all went in, and I normally just stayed in the back and was really kind of unobtrusive, but I got up and walked around because I wanted to see how the students were reacting to this. And what I found is some students were listening and then they would rewind or go back to re-listen to something again. Other students would move forward, and basically everybody was learning, and then they went in and did some activity that worked with the material. And it was a very, very powerful way to learn, but this gave tremendous learner control. And I would probably tell you sometimes shorter, what I call lecturettes, are probably better. 3 small lecturettes are probably better than 1 big one if you can structure them. Doing this and in higher ed, a lot of our professors, and Ryan can probably equate to that, don't do short lectures. We do long lectures. You might do an hour and a half narrated PowerPoint. It's just probably way too long for something like that. Okay. Question out of Mr. Salinas' class?
We have a block schedule as well. And, I try to keep my lectures, when you're teaching a high school class and you're talking about something like the Crusades, it doesn't lend itself to a 10-minute, it doesn't lend itself introductory to a 10-minute lecture.
Yeah, you can't cover the Crusades in 10 minutes.
Yeah, you can't cover the Crusades in 10 minutes. So generally what the kids would discover, kind of like what you did with that teacher in Fox Chapel, is I would put on a 20, sometimes even, I think my longest was 25 minutes. And then the kids would have it at home, and it would often take them, because there was so much information being given, almost like a full hour, maybe even a little more to do it. So it was an expectation to me that that would be like one of our blocks, But if I gave 3 small lectures, I don't know in a block schedule, which is an every other day block, how I would cover the material I would need to cover in a year if there was only like one 10-minute block or 10-minute lecture for each block. I need to get
what I'm talking about is not minimizing the content, not by any means. What I'm saying is just break your content up. Break it up so that, and your students, what they can absorb and what they can't. This is just general rules of thumb. Generally, I do 30-minute lectures, but I try and break them up and say, maybe after so many minutes. And in fact, when you're standing in front of your classroom, and this is what I mean by lecture. I will guarantee if you're standing there talking for 30 minutes, you're not lecturing for 30 minutes. You break it up in there and you provide a question somewhere within, 5-10 minutes.
No, the kids ask questions all the time.
Bingo.
Constantly ask questions. But
right. So it's broken up.
PowerPoint, it's hard to think. It's taken away. With the narrated PowerPoint, it's taken away. They don't have the ability to ask me a question when I have uploaded this thing to provide, that natural flow of the class that happens in one of my normal lectures just does not happen within the narrated PowerPoint.
Bingo. All right. So what you want to do is, and what you're trying to do is mirror in the online what you do in the face-to-face, where you have that level of interaction. Now, if you're doing this synchronously like we're doing right now, yeah, you can kind of mirror that face-to-face. So if you're standing in front of them, you know, that becomes an easier thing. I can present my lecture, and yes, they can jump in and ask questions. So it mirrors the face-to-face. But if you're doing this through a narrated PowerPoint, now you can't do that because you're not in real time. They're listening to it, you know, differently. And so how do you? I would probably argue that, you know, maybe you have them listen to your lecture, and maybe what you do is break up your lecture after maybe 10, 15 minutes and say, okay, stop the narration, answer this question. And maybe you say, okay, write down whatever questions you have, and now then move on. And then what we do is you can post those, or have, if you're doing this, and I'm talking asynchronously now, you could have them post this up in a discussion thread. In other words, where you have them do a discussion board on this, and now you can flesh out different ideas, answer their questions. They could do it through email. This is where now this type of communication, this asynchronous communication, needs to be exacerbated a little bit, needs to be increased. And this is where that instructor presence and them of having the ability to interact with you to ask those questions becomes paramount.
Now, the other tricky thing in those is that sometimes the kid, those were great suggestions, by the way. The other thing that's tricky in this is that the kids now all know that they can speed up to a minute, time and a half or two, or they will just shut off the lecture and watch the slides, and they're missing content
Right.
when not listening to me talk. So maybe again that goes back to setting the expectations at the beginning.
Yeah.
Time
Let's face it,
right?
you know, there are always going to be students who are going to find ways to shortcut. And I don't know how you stop that. I've never figured out, and I always work with the idea that, you know, students, of course, I'm dealing with a higher ed these days, but when I was in the K through 12 classroom, you know, it was always the idea, I set the expectations, I put the learning in place, and you make them responsible for that learning through the assignments, through, you know, through discussion boards, because, and this goes back to, you know, what we were talking about yesterday. The discussion boards are going to give you greater formative evaluation. You're going to know through a discussion board whether a student listened to your video, listened to your narrated PowerPoint, or they didn't, because they can't hide doing the discussion there. So if you post up a narrated video or a narrated PowerPoint of you lecturing on material, and you set down expectations for answering discussion boards, they're not going to be able to answer those unless they've watched your narration. So you'll know, and you know what? Excuse me, they'll know, you know.
I did it through a Google quiz. Whenever I gave them the Google quiz, there was always one or two questions that were based on what I said, not what I wrote on the slides.
Right.
And it was amazing how many of the kids had no idea, you know, that they were like, I didn't remember this. You know, it's like, because you probably didn't listen to my lecture if you didn't remember this.
Yeah.
So you probably didn't listen to
The other thing is, if you put a discussion thread up that addresses certain things and asks them to address certain, you say, hey, in this, you know, in the lecture we talked about X, you know, build on that. What do you think of that? And you will have given them enough information that you're going to go, oh, okay, I got to go back and listen to this so that I can provide something cogent. After the first couple of times that they don't do something, and you know, they're going to realize the expectation is, hey, I got to listen to this. I've got to listen to this narrative PowerPoint, and I got to move forward with it.
One of my history colleagues came up with a great suggestion. He had a blank bullet point on his slides, and that blank bullet point was the one that they had to be listening to the lecture to fill it in. That was,
Right.
I thought that was a brilliant suggestion. You know, way to go, Evan, wherever you are.
I agree. Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit quickly, because we've got about, I figure about 10 plus minutes left, 10, 15 minutes left. I knew you guys get lunch. Is that correct? Thank you, Leslie. I want to go through and talk a little bit about teaching synchronously, and I will try and do this in short fashion. Some things for you to think about as you develop and structure your Google Meets. Just some ideas. Just some general rules that I find. Choose a location with good internet connection and no disturbances if you can. In other words, cloister yourself away so that you are able to do that. Are you planning on doing your synchronous in your own classrooms? Are you planning on working from home as teachers? Are you planning on working from school as teachers? You don't know that yet. How'd you do it in the spring?
Yeah, from home this spring because we weren't considered essential workers, but I understand that has changed and it's so much easier to do it from school, although some teachers have kids at home. So
Yeah.
it will.
Yeah, you've got some things to work through, but if you're doing it from school, it's simple. You go into your classroom, you close your door, you've got everything there, you go. One of the advantages of doing it from your classroom is you can structure and set your computer up with your camera or however you've done it, where you could have whiteboard behind you and writing and doing. Those are sometimes things that you can do. You just have to make sure that your camera is set, that your lighting is set, and we'll talk a little bit about those. What I would tell you to do is find a good internet connection. If you're doing it at work, great. If you're not, you're doing it from home, find a good internet connection. If you've got multiple people at home that are on the internet, you probably need to tell somebody to get off because you need to take precedent for that because of the bandwidth. And you want no disturbances. Establish your etiquette, your ground rules, and any guidelines that you want to establish. This is key. Establish also the rules that whether and how you want students to use the chat room function that exists. Nobody in this has utilized the chat room function. You certainly could have. I could have put that up if you wanted to ask any questions. This is one of those things that takes a lot of coordination on your part, though, because not only you're coordinating your PowerPoints, coordinating whatever materials you're working off of through files, you're coordinating everybody on the screen, you're coordinating the technology, but now you have to watch the chat room and see what questions are being asked within there. And that now just adds another dimension, another dynamic on there as well. I would have students make sure that they don't talk over each other. I would have them mute their mics to avoid background noise until they're ready to talk. But when they're ready to talk, please have some kind of expectation. Either they raise their hand, either they just, unmute their mic, whatever it happens to be that you want to establish, but establish a routine for that so that they can get in and make things happen. I would make materials and handouts available online. This is where you can put your materials. In other words, if you're going to do a synchronous session today, post the materials and have them be able to get that through their Google Classrooms ahead of time. This is how you transfer things electronically. And, somebody said, well, why can't I just email it to them? You could, but here's the problem. Things won't be organized, especially when you're doing mass amounts of sending information. This is why I would tell you to keep your Google Classroom shells organized in such a way that they know where to go. Go back to the idea that the narration, this week we're going to do this, we will meet synchronously. You need to have those structures in place. Make the materials and handouts available. Be aware of your body language that could be lost in video conferencing classrooms. Right now, you are only seeing me from here up. You don't know what's going on or what I'm doing. So I'm making hand motions you can't see. Be careful that, the things that you think are being communicated with body language as you do in the face-to-face, they get lost in the video conferencing or the Google Classroom synchronous. The key other thing that I would tell you to do is get your students involved. That's not always an easy thing to do, as we've kind of talked before, but get your students involved because the talking head thing, they will get lost. You know this. You read your students in class. If you're standing up there lecturing, and I mean lecturing where they don't interact, where they're just passive versus active learners, you're going to lose them in 10 minutes. We know from the literature that the average adult's attention span is about 7 minutes. Kids, I think, is something less. So you want to get kids involved, you want to get your students involved, but again, you know them, and the rules and things that you do in the face-to-face to be successful, you want to do this in the synchronous as well. Engage students, encourage dialogue, establish rapport, and promote interactivity. These are all things that you want to do. The same thing that you do in your face-to-face, you want this to be collaborative in the online. Remote students will generally have some difficulty staying engaged. If the lecture is not engaging, if it's very tense, or if they get bored with things, and kids do get bored with things very quickly. So you know this in your face-to-face, you got to change things up quickly. Make things as energetic as possible, as interactive as possible. Your voice is a very, very strong component of that, but also the animations, the playfulness, the having fun, allowing them. And here's what's going to happen initially, and you probably saw this in the spring, students don't participate as much until you set that expectation that you want them to, and you ask them direct questions and force them to, so they become more interactive. Don't think of yourself as being on camera, just talk naturally. Some people initially get a little nervous doing this. You don't need to. Try to relax, act natural, teach as you would if they were sitting in front of you in a face-to-face. Assume that the remote students can see and hear everything because they can. And you're kind of surprised sometimes what comes across on camera. Maintain eye contact, and this is something that is problematic. You will notice if I look off to the side to look at my screen where I have the PowerPoint, it doesn't look like I'm connecting with you. So try and stay as focused to looking in the camera as much as you can. I work off a two-screen system, so my remote's up, so I can see all of you, and at the same time take a look at my screen. You try and work as much as you can. If I put it on this screen, it's small, I can't see it, and then I can't see you. So maintain eye contact as much as you possibly can. Keep movement to a minimum, as big gestures can be distracting. If you're moving your body or the camera's moving, it becomes distracting. You want to stay stationary as much as you can. Sit up straight, don't lean back, avoid reading excessively. The same rules that we put in place for anything. If you have a tendency to read something, then all they're seeing is the top of your head. And if you're follically challenged like I am, that becomes problematic. Minimize the distractions, such as any tapping, any sounds that you're making here transfer through your computer. You may not realize it because you're just sitting here tapping normally, but that becomes disturbing for anybody on the other side. Don't click pens. Be careful of fixing your hair. You want to try and eliminate background noises, hence why you always establish that students mute their microphones. Because a lot of times, people walking through, it does cause distractions for that. Speak clearly in your normal voice and enunciate clearly. Talk naturally, use voice inflections, and this goes back to that conversational tone. Talk to them as if they were sitting in front of you. Pause when you expect a response from the remote site, and this is something that has to be accentuated because it's going to take a longer period of time. You ask a question, and because they're sitting remotely, there's a longer period of time that goes between you asking a question and the response that you're going to get from students. It just happens. If you need to, repeat the questions and wait for student responses. It goes back to what was being discussed out of Mr. Salinas' classroom. Simply ask them questions directly sometimes. And I don't know who was saying that before, but it was, I think, came out of a couple. Clothing, generally you want to wear solid colors. Going with, a lot of stripes and plaids and things of that nature sometimes will not translate well over camera. So use solid colors. Muted patterns or dark or neutral colors are probably best. One of the resources I looked at said blue is probably the best color. Okay, I don't know. Dark or neutral colors, earth tones, and pastels will also work well. Be careful of heavy, nice shirt. Subtle jewelry. If you're one that wears a lot of jewelry, be careful. I'm not seeing anybody that is, but sometimes I've known people that are just, very vivacious with their jewelry. Sometimes that can be distracting. Avoid busy patterns, plaids, pinstripes, tweeds, checks, prints, glittery and reflective fabric. All white or strong black-white contrast, those sometimes don't translate well. Reds and blacks sometimes in the lighting don't translate well. They have a tendency to bleed on the screen from time to time. It just depends upon the lighting that you're doing. I would also tell you, you have to watch lighting. Now, I'll share with you, when I first started doing synchronous sessions, I was using overhead lighting because that's what I had in my dining room. And being follically challenged, I was getting, and a couple of you may understand this, I was getting a glare. And, as I'm seeing, you're getting a glare from that. So you want to be careful that sometimes you need to light from below or you also have to watch background light. Sometimes that gets too much and can wash you out. So be careful of too much or too little lighting. What I would tell you to do is go in a few minutes before and set your lighting. You can see before your students come in how they perceive and how they can see you with the lighting. So you just need to be aware of any glare that's coming through the camera or how you're lighting yourself. So what I would like to do is open this up for any other comments or questions that we have. We've kind of come to the end of what we can do. Does anybody have any questions over anything that we have not talked about or anything that you would like to address?
We're good here.
Everybody good? Leslie, any questions from your end?
No, that was helpful. Did you tell me, Richard, that you're going to forward those PowerPoints to me?
Yes. What I will do is
That will help.
hang on, I'm going to stop the recording at this point.